to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience for the broad front that we need to. On today's episode, we're building our Attention Economy Navigator for the month of June 2026. The goal of Block and Build has always been to help organizers figure out what's happening, how people are responding, and really get a sense for what's working out in the world. The Attention Economy Navigator is our way of visually mapping some of the most and least talked about news stories of the month and help our audience orient to what's worth your attention and what could use a little less. Here's how the Navigator works. My panel of guests, who you'll meet in a moment, will work with me to plot some of the most discussed news stories from the past month onto a two-dimensional graph, reflecting where we think they fall on a spectrum of signal versus noise on one axis and conspiracy versus reality on the other. If you'd like a visual, you can always watch this episode on YouTube or find the final graph in article form on our website. To explain this a little bit better, let's take a trip back to high school geometry and envision a standard XY graph. On the x-axis, we're measuring signal versus noise, with high signal being furthest to the right and high noise being furthest to the left. Noisy stories are those that have little meaning. They're part of the chatter, but they aren't going to stick with us, and they don't mean much to our long-term media and political environment. Contrast that with high signal stories, which have deep, long-term implications and impact on our world. Then on the y-axis, we're measuring consensus reality versus conspiracy theory. High reality stories are those that are really happening. These are based in hard reporting, they're rooted in consensus reality, and are observable in the world. High conspiracy stories are those which are a little more speculative. They might be actual conspiracy theories, or they might be based in conjecture. This leaves us with four quadrants. The top right quadrant is high signal, high reality. These are the stories that are meaty and demand our attention, and which are both happening and mean something. Those that are high noise and high conspiracy fall in the bottom left, and probably deserve a little less attention, even if people can't stop talking about them. High noise, high reality stories are things that we don't think will last the media cycle, while high signal and high conspiracy stories are a particularly interesting category because they might be driven by conspiracy theory, but do tell us something meaningful about the world that we live in. The finalized graph plot is linked in the show notes and can be found on Convergence's website for you to follow along. You can also pop over to watch this episode on our YouTube channel, where our intern Trey is going to help us lay out the graph in real time. To help build this month's Attention Economy Navigator, I am joined by the co-founder, CEO, and a writer at techpolicy.press, Justin Hendrix. Justin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Caden.
We're also going to be joined by senior multimedia producer of this show and all of Convergence's podcasts, Josh Elstro. Josh, thanks for being on this end of the mic this time.
Hey, Caden. Happy to do it.
All right. So we've collected some headlines for discussion today, and the way this will work is I'll call on each of you in order to have you introduce a story. We'll put about 5 minutes on the clock for discussion, and then we will try and place that story on this graph. Y'all ready?
Absolutely.
As ready as I'll be. Let's go.
All right, Justin, let's start with you. What is the first story that you want to talk about today?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we've been kind of watching out the corner of our eye and writing about in different ways over the last few months and years is Elon Musk's extraordinary rise to become the world's first trillionaire. Of course, with the SpaceX IPO just last week, we saw his wealth climb that extraordinary threshold, and here we are in a world of trillionaires, and probably more to come in the near term. So that's the one I would put up there.
Great. Yeah, I had somebody joke to me yesterday that we did get rid of a billionaire, but unfortunately it's because he became a trillionaire. And I was like, that's not the right kind of getting rid of billionaires.
Wrong direction.
Wrong direction. I think there's the other thing that's interesting about this story is I think that like the headlines that I see are like, oh, world's first trillionaire. But I think the thing that is like a level below the surface here is about like all of the kind of like regulatory irregularities that are part of the SpaceX IPO, and also like what this means for kind of like Musk's power, both in the economy and society. So yeah, I'm wondering if there are things that you're tracking about that are worth talking about.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the rise of Musk and you think about how he's built his companies, every step of the way, there has been government support, there has been government funding, there has been, regulators willing to look the other way at different points. At this point, the question is he unassailable? Is he beyond reproach? And we'll find out in the near term whether, in fact, he is in a place that perhaps no other human's been, a kind of, I don't know, national security asset on some level for the United States, very important to its communications, military, infrastructural ambitions. I don't know. We'll see whether any other jurisdiction around the world could ever potentially contain his ambitions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and all of the things that I've read about, basically the way that like SpaceX has like hit the stock market, like it's almost like it feels a little rushed. Maybe like there's like ways in which I'm like, I don't think this can't be good in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, if I could like just quickly throw like some numbers behind that,
Yeah.
like the idea that it came on as the biggest IPO of all time, $75 billion evaluation. I just doing like rough back the envelope math. I'm pretty sure that's like 3 times the biggest one of all time, which I believe was like Saudi Aramco. And it's like, I know just enough about finance to know like that doesn't sound good, especially considering like this is not a brand and a company that turns a profit, and like that their Starlink component is the only thing that they actually make money on up to this point. And Justin, I don't know if you have any more insight to like that end of it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, all the reporting suggests that SpaceX is not profitable, and may not have any path to near-term profitability. And the entire kind of point of the company is literally aimed at the stars, aimed at a massive ambition that may never become real. But of course, you've also got all these other things now packed into SpaceX, XAI, X itself, these other bits and pieces that have been folded in. And, now we're seeing people wondering whether eventually the goal will be the mega merger of SpaceX and Tesla, which may take things to an entirely different level. So, we'll see.
I guess the question is where it belongs on this graph, because I feel like there are things about it that are obviously very real in terms of like now we're like the entire stock market is now sort of like wrapped up in Elon Musk's business in like a really new and dramatic way. But there's also a way in which I'm like, it feels conspiratorial, like that the valuation feels conspiratorial to me. Like what's the deal here? Where do you think it belongs?
Yeah, maybe the word conspiracy isn't quite right here. Maybe it's more like hype. Maybe that's the thing. And if you think of hype as a kind of conspiracy of markets and elites and financial interests and political actors and all sorts of other parties, then maybe it does kind of go in that direction. But I don't know. I think if I were having to tell your listener how to regard this phenomena, I would say, unfortunately, this is reality and it's signal. And I would put it in the upper right-hand quadrant, kind of where you have it right now. This is something we should be paying attention to. This is important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that it strikes me as correct. There's like discourses about it that feel much more sort of noisy and conspiratorial, but that like we are talking about actual money and like it's also so large that like, and it's in an index fund. So like it like people's pensions and stuff are going to be bought into SpaceX. Like there's a way in which it's like too real in some ways.
Absolutely. And I personally, don't look at my retirement, meager as it might be, that often. But when I go next to check on my 403B, 401k, I'll have to look and see if in fact I am also somehow fractionally invested in this man's wild ambitions.
Yeah.
Can I throw in like an instigation a little bit?
Sure.
That like I don't think it puts it on the other side of the conspiracy line, but it lowers it a little bit to me. As I was watching the media hype, I'm the sort of the media obsessive here, and like what's the narrative around things. And what was fascinating to me watching this IPO happen last week was the way like mainstream media has, I don't know what sort of washing you call this, of Elon's reputation, who like we can look only a year ago that this man was very materially dismantling the federal government in ways that are like massively impacting things all over the world to this day. That is very fascinating and strange to me. That makes it feel like a little conspiratorial, and just that like why are we still hyping this guy in the media as if anything he says is going to come to fruition in a way that like helps or impacts working people in a positive way?
Sure.
Like they're talking about, I think he said in like the speech announcing like the IPO or when the market opened or whatever, we're going to put data centers in space, you know? And it's like, okay, you were going to go to Mars 10 years ago too. And like, where are we on this? That like no one ever in the media ever really questions the sort of like P.T. Barnum-esque like factor of Elon Musk very deeply or for very long. Like
Yeah.
I'm starting to think of he's like the Gen X Trump who like, thankfully, as long as our laws hold, like he can't run for president at least, you know? So it's like, it's like a little closer to the line to me, but it's not full conspiracy.
You know, I think there's a lot of kind of sweeping under the carpet of things to do with Musk in the business press in particular. But you did see it on social media. A lot of people pointing out, look at this man encouraging racist pogroms in Belfast on the same week that he becomes a trillionaire.
Sure.
You know, another thing that really struck me. I don't know. I was watching a speech not a speech, I suppose a fireside chat, as they are called, that Musk gave at Davos earlier this year. He was on stage with Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock. And, you know, this conversation about tech and how to shape an abundant future, et cetera. And this was exactly at the moment that the, ex Grok nudifier scandal was raging.
Yeah.
And, of course, not a single question about that to Musk in this context. I mean, of course, I shouldn't expect Larry Fink, of all people, to hold power to account. But it just strikes me that, in certain circumstances or in certain rooms, Elon Musk goes in and he's committed no sins. He is someone to be lionized, to be hailed, to be regarded as hero, and to be regarded as oracle. Someone whose every utterance about the future is something we should hang on to. It could be potentially the thing that we can grab onto and maybe ride into the stars as well. So I don't know. That bugs me. That he's in this particular situation.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I was reading a lot about the IPO at the same time that there were people who are associated with USAID and the World Health Organization talking about how the Ebola outbreak was not caught
that's what I was thinking
early enough. Right. In large part because we dismantled USAID and we pulled out of the World Health Organization. So much of that had to do with Musk and the federal government, right? It is a little crazy making to be we're so ready. Some people are so ready to lionize this guy, and also just by ignoring the fact that actions have consequences, he can kind of live in a world without them. It feels like.
Yeah, there's a great book out right now, Ben Tarnoff and Quinn Slobodian, Muskism, if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, which, kind of looks at Musk, not only, the history of his behavior and building his companies, the rest of that, but kind of thinks of him more as a kind of artifact of our time, a kind of symptom of the current political economy, and sort of asks, about sort of bigger lessons that are to be drawn. And I think that's also a valuable thing to do. And one of the reasons, by the way, which I'd kind of put it in reality and signal up again at right where we've placed it, I think there is something to be learned from him, not just looking at, him as a individual and as a phenomenon, but him as a sort of signal, literally, of the world we're in and how it works.
Yeah. Okay. No, I co-sign that. I'm happy with where it's at then.
Cool. Josh, I'm going to toss it over to you. I know that you wanted to talk about the Grand Platinum of it all.
Yeah, wanting to is a strong way to put it.
Feel compelled to. How about that?
It feels like we've reached a moment that it needs addressed in our side of the world. I don't know how much I need to go through the details of, mainstream media is breathlessly walking us through these scandals regarding Graham Plattner, his race for Senate in Maine. There was obviously his Totenkopf tattoo, which it's bizarre. There's then I'm trying to get them in order. I believe next were his Reddit posts.
Yeah.
And we'll sort of readdress these. Then the sexting scandal that the leak was his wife in the first place. And then finally, like the big New York Times piece that was like, hey, we think he was a pretty bad boyfriend through the 2010s. In which, though, like there are like serious things that I'm like, my ideal senator would be somebody who's never done these things, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And I think Mainers are in a weird position. What I see on social media is that the momentum, and sure, Janet Mills essentially suspended her campaign and was basically out of the race when his primary happened a few weeks ago. But like, I mean, he won by a bajillion points. But like, you see the feedback and comments on social media. Who knows how much of this is organic? And people are mad at the media hit jobs and very on his side. I just personally, where I land is like, I'm glad I don't have to vote in Maine. You know, I think it's a very messy situation, and that what I found most bizarre is the amount of resources dedicated by mainstream media towards these and digging this opposition research up. And like one of the most striking ones was NPR did this analysis of like, why can't we find scandal-free candidates again? And they're naming him where like his scandals, I will say, I chalk them up to like, this is a messy, just human being. This is like a naturally messy human. He's a guy I went to high school with, you know? Like, I know this guy. I know a lot of this guy. And like in their hearts, they're not bad guys. And on the campaign trail, he's saying all the correct things. But there's this like machine that needs to destroy him. And in this NPR article, they're talking about his scandals about like, yeah, my wife knew I was texting and we went to therapy, on the same level as like Eric Swalwell, Tony Gonzalez in Texas, which is horrifying if you know that story. And then Ken Paxton, who has just a mountain of things against him also in Texas. I'm not going to go into the details of how gross they are, but like there are multitudes like of different abuses of power in those scandals versus what you see in Graham Plattner's like, this is a messy guy. And what he keeps saying is like, look, I was going through a hard time. I suffered from PTSD. And it raises this question for like, especially us, like as like movement people of like, who is welcome in our movements and what levels of power do we want them to be seeking? My personal feeling is like, if you want a guy like Plattner, he should maybe start at like school board, you know, like why and how did this guy end up just shooting for Maine senator? I was like, even digging around, like I can't really find a good origin story for why he was like, I should run for Senate, you know? So for that reason, like, I don't know. I put this kind of, it's pretty like Signal, maybe halfway up Signal, because it's like most of the stuff coming out is true, but like, what are the motivations behind the people who are digging this deeply to like try to put it on the same level as some of these like real, like serious abusers? But I'd put it also like below the conspiracy line about the same amount, about halfway, quarter down, because it's like, I don't know what's going on beyond the scenes of like sort of legacy media that they're dedicating so many resources to digging up opposition research on this guy when it's like, no, there's demons all around. I've been baffled by it. For months now.
It is weird. I also, I feel have the same feel as you, Josh, that I'm like, I'm glad I'm not voting in Maine because this feels rough. And like, you know, I do think that there's a lot of, this has been challenging my, like, how much do I pay attention to social media discourse? Because we do know that there's like sock puppet accounts and bots and whatever. And like, I don't know, it's very challenging in that way too, that like, I'm like, I don't know who is operating what and in what direction. I will say that one of the most sort of like sober, thoughtful, and reflective commentators out of Maine who I've been reading is, the blog is called Black Girl in Maine. What is her name? She's somebody who has been really thoughtful. Shay is her name, but she's been somebody who's been very thoughtful writing about and talking about Plattner's candidacy and the work that he and his campaign have done to reach out to communities of color in Maine, to people who have a lot of questions about Graham. And I think that like to me, her writing is like, it feels very honest. It feels very earnest. And she clearly is like, with reservations, I'm supporting Plattner because of the things that the like concrete things that we need to change and the kind of organizing work that he's been trying to do. But that like, it's clearly not simple. And like, you know, one of the things that she wrote about after the last New York Times hit piece about like his exes was like, look, the conditions we have create the candidates we get, and what we do with that is up to us. But like, it's hard. We're in a hard situation right now, and like there are opportunities and there are challenges. And it's a weird time to be doing politics. So.
Yeah, it's like very much a like, let's do a little bit of power map analysis in this moment, and like, how important is it to take this Senate seat versus I didn't mention like, oh, he's got some bizarre Reddit posts that are kind of all over the place, which is like another thing I looked back to is like that we have all lived as humans on the internet for 20-25 years now, as millennials are going to start running for office more and more, that like I've probably said stupid stuff on the internet that if I run for office, somebody will dig up. And I haven't said anything on Plattner level, I don't think. He said some pretty bad stuff in my opinion, but like they could find a way to squeeze it out of context and go like, oh, look at this guy, he's this, he's that. And how do we navigate that moving forward? And how do we, like, as movements, better develop candidates so that we are moving people who have been like movement active for a long time into these higher positions, so that we don't have these like left field candidates? I'm going to go off a little bit about my theory of what I've been calling these. So Graham Plattner's a soft version of what I call the Eddington candidate. And I've noticed these more and more. If you're not familiar with the movie Eddington by Ari Aster, it's about the summer of 2020, COVID, Black Lives Matter, and like a local sheriff who gets like radicalized online into like a right-wing pipeline, and then like a kind of left-wing guy who's the mayor. And the sheriff decides like, I'm going to run for higher office. I'm going to run for mayor because of all the stuff he's being radicalized online about, but he has no political experience outside of that. And like in my home district in Ohio, we had a candidate like that who like, it was very clear he was not super politically engaged pre like, 2020 era. And he doesn't have any like organizing experience outside of that. Not that like that's completely disqualifying, but it was like the level of interest and engagement of people's politics is sort of stops at the online experience, the social media experience, and they're now starting to run for office. Marjorie Taylor Greene is like the most successful version of this. She was QAnon, the Jewish space laser conspiracy theory, and she made it, you know. Like, so these candidates are popping up, and Graham feels like a soft version of that, of like, he was very political online and not offline very much before this campaign started, from all records that I could find. So it's very interesting.
Well, without saying anything in particular about Plattner or you know, making any judgment on how we should feel about his particular background, I do think the phenomenon of a digital permanent record, you know, is interesting and definitely one that is kind of going to play out over the next couple of decades, as you know, we have whole generations of folks seeking office who have lived their entire lives online. But I also wonder, to some extent, if the situation might heal itself a little. I mean, I know that I teach, and many of my students don't post on social media at all. You know, there are huge numbers of young people they're consumers of social media, but they would never say something political there. And I do wonder, to some extent, if we'll see a newer generation kind of already kind of practicing some defensive tactics in this regard, who may come along without that digital permanent record, or at least without a digital permanent record that is quite as, you know, well, what's the right word? I don't know if it's concerning, salacious, dark in some ways, as Graham Plattner's.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Because I also feel like it's. I mean, this also makes me wonder. Again, it's like it makes me wonder about just like the comment farms. Like who is posting on the internet? And I think it might be like boomers and Gen Xers and maybe some millennials. But yeah,
And we know that for a fact, right?
yeah.
The very few people post, most people consume, and on some level, I mean, I step back from it. Sometimes I wonder if we're not in the beginning of sort of social media sort of dying,
Hmm.
more generally. Whether will in 10 years people will be spending so much time on Reddit or on certainly uh, Twitter or X, whatever other platform. It's hard to imagine. It seems like something different is happening, coming along, even at this moment, and so that might change the dynamic down the line.
Yeah, and like the last thing I'll say on Platinum before we move on is like I'm the kind of person it's like I kind of want to buy his explanations of like PTSD is a serious disease, loneliness is real, and a lot of my behavior was rooted in that. I've been through like PTSD therapies myself and can see like no, it can really rewire your brain and change a person. I'm a completely different person than I was 10 years ago. And I wouldn't want to be judged by who I was 10 years ago. And people like seem to, again, in terms of just looking at like polling data and if we're believing comments on social media are real, like are starting to kind of like see that growth or like accept that growth. It's like we're moving past this sort of like purity politics of cancel culture, which we've like done some analysis of at Convergence, but whether or not it's honest in coming from Plattner, I'm not here to say anybody should pick one side or the other. Just where's your heart? Go with it if you have to
Yeah.
vote.
I think it's a very difficult thing to sort. I was just earlier today listening to an interview where a historian who had looked at John Lewis's life was talking about this interview that Lewis did late in his life with a person who had literally been part of beating him down, during the civil rights movement many, many years ago. And he'd encountered this person. I think the number of years was 48 years later. And this person had effectively apologized to him, and said that he tried not to think about that day and, was clearly horrified at his own behavior. So the conversation was about, how people's minds change and
Mhm.
sometimes their hearts, change. And I think one of the questions that is often at the center of this stuff is kind of what is the time period that has to go by before
Right.
we'll believe someone when they say, my mind has changed, my heart has changed, I
Mhm.
regret the things that I did in past. How do they have to say it? To whom do they have to say it? So I don't know. I'm not commenting on Plattner specifically, but these are like bigger questions that I wonder about sometimes, particularly as people yo-yo back and forth between different political views, which I think is a common thing these days. There's not a center of gravity for a lot of people. The world is very confusing. And so you do see people back and forth between different, in some cases, what we might regard as extreme positions or ideologies, and changing their minds.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
much of the research also shows that people are like ordinary people are not ideological, right? Like they don't have a coherent political ideology in the way that like some of us who think about this all day do. Right?
I'm the weird one.
Exactly. We are actually the freaks.
Yeah.
So, speaking of people, ordinary people engaging in political activity, I do think one of the big stories that I want to talk about is, I mean, in some ways, we got to talk about the FBI raids on these anti-ICE protesters in Minneapolis that happened earlier this week. And then I want to link it to a larger story about the way that the FBI and the Department of Justice are being weaponized as part of a drumbeat towards the midterms this fall. So 15 people in Minneapolis were indicted on charges that are really about like protesting ICE, impeding ICE, legally observing ICE activities in Minneapolis during Operation Metro Surge. A lot of these charges remind me a lot of the Broadview Detention Center protests in Chicago, that like all of those charges were actually recently thrown out because what those protesters were doing was like very clearly protected speech. And, you know, there's also the other case that we've talked about on this show is the Prairieland Detention Center case in Texas, where because protesters came armed, they were able to secure some convictions against those folks. The way that these raids were carried out, sort of like first thing in the morning in Minneapolis, they were like knocking on people's doors. They were like showing up and not like always clearly identifying themselves as law enforcement. Like it was clearly designed to intimidate people, to intimidate the city of Minneapolis, right? To be like, you guys are found to be out of line. I think it's not a coincidence that it comes right on the heels of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative getting raided in Ohio. It's a voting rights group in Ohio. And the tactics seem very similar, right? Like going to the homes of people who are either volunteered or paid canvassers, harassing them first thing in the morning, just like freaking people out. And I think the reason that this story is important is, one, obviously, these are people who are now in federal custody, who, you know, one, innocent until proven guilty, and two, like largely are participating in protected speech activities, right? Either legal observation, protesting, whatever. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this stuff in the next 5 months as we watch the sort of like run up to the midterms in November. One, because I think this is a way that the administration can keep their narrative about who protesters are in the media, right? Like they can seed that, and like these sort of spectacular images of raids, of people being arrested, serves their sort of story about who protesters are and what they're doing. You know, I think about the arrests that happened in conjunction with that church protest in Minneapolis too, where like the White House doctored that picture of Nikki Levy Armstrong. That a lot of this is about their media game that they're trying to play, and villainizing the left, talking about people who are like anti-ICE being like anti-American and like potentially quote unquote domestic terrorists. Again, whatever the hell that means. I feel like this is unfortunately pretty high reality, but I do think that because of that, the like work that this does for the administration, there's a way in which it's closer to the center of signal and noise than just pure signal, because like it is designed to be part of a drumbeat of intimidation. So it's like, you know, closer to that, the y-axis, just because it's intended both to impede movements, but it's also meant to scare the shit out of regular people. And it does both things. It is actually really effective. It's an effective weaponization of the Department of Justice. And yeah, I guess that's the thing. And it stresses me. It really stresses me out.
You know, I haven't looked deeply at the indictments, and I don't know precisely, you know, what the accusations against each of these individuals are. But clearly, you know, I think at this stage, you know, there's a reason to worry about the FBI, the Department of Justice's intent, particularly when it comes to, you know, anything to do with protesters. And anything to do with ICE. So it'll be interesting to see how these play out and what precisely, you know, the evidence ultimately put forward into the record looks like. But I will say one thing we do know about a lot of the evidence that is in these indictments is that a lot of it comes from signal messages.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, my ears as a tech policy person always kind of, you know, I guess ring a little bit when I see that. And people are often wondering, you know, well, how did they get those signal messages? Aren't those supposed to be encrypted, et cetera? The Intercept did some reporting on this. They appear to be, you know,
I was going to ask you to go over this. I think where you're going here. Yes.
Yeah. The easiest answer, which is always, you know, or most likely answer, is that the feds got hold of, you know, phones, effectively got hold of the devices and were able to, you know, assess the the signal history of these demonstrators from that. I mean, I know there's reference to call logs, between different individuals, different messages, hundreds of messages, in fact, I think that are referenced in these indictments. So that's one of the things I think that just from a tech point of view is interesting to me in this. It's always, how is this going? And if you look at Minnesota more generally, I mean, I can't remember which official it was. It might have been Tom Homan, who actually said something along the lines that he was impressed, in fact, by the degree to which anti-ICE demonstrators in Minnesota were able to communicate, able to develop communications channels. And of course, a lot of that was across encrypted messaging apps like Signal. And it was extremely effective, in organizing the population. So, no wonder that the first thing that folks would want to do, if in fact they're looking deeply at that behavior and looking for potential crimes to charge, would be to try to look into their signal history.
And this was the case with Prairieland as well, that a lot of the evidence in that case was from the sort of like on-device push notifications that were then recovered by law enforcement as part of the investigation. That like, even though the Prairieland defendants were also using Signal, it's like if you let Signal display a message preview, iOS stores that message preview in an unencrypted, just like device encryption location. It was a sobering reminder that developers can make the best encryption available, but that like silly interactions between your device and their software can create weak points in your security protocol.
Yeah, I was going to sort of add on, just anybody who relies on Signal for, sort of its security purposes. It's maybe do a little research real quick to make sure like you've done your end user side of making sure that it's correctly locked down. I did dive into the indictments because it's interesting, some of the stuff that they're like trying to go after them for. One of them that I pulled that I was just like, this is strange, is that they're being charged with tracking ICE vehicles and officers using databases and chats, quote unquote. That's straight out of there. I didn't know it was illegal to observe law enforcement all of a sudden. I think that's a little strange to go after. And to this end, like, I'll add that what I'm seeing is it's like a creeping attempt to see how far can we push this kind of prosecution, because like if we do look at Prairieland, we can add up all these little details that put it in the administration's favor to get that conviction of like a firearm did discharge. And like then you look at like the alignment, like the Trump basically alignment of all the judges and all the courts that it had to go through. It was like this was the perfect place for them to do one of these Antifa prosecutions and pull it off. And then you see the Chicago Metro Surge thing, I was like, no, obviously this is not going down. And I mean, just from what I know of the Minnesota organizers, we've met some of them, I've observed them online, like these are really just like neighbors looking out for each other. This is not a like black bloc Antifa, deeply like anti-government, these are truly just neighbors out there. And like I didn't go through all the names of the people who were indicted, but like I don't think there's much there. It feels like there's something going on in their sort of authoritarian creep of trying to dissent on speech of like, let's try to push a little further with each of these indictments and see what we can get away with. And like the optimist in me is saying like the center will hold. Like some people are going to go through hard stuff, but like there's a wall that they're not going to be able to press through at this point.
It'll be interesting to see, how this plays out. I mean, I just on the news reporting, I mean, I know some of the allegations in the indictments are about statements that do look like explicit incitement to violence. And so that, clearly is something that will have to be sorted out. And I think that's one of the things that just abstracting away from this situation, multiple things can be true at once, right?
Totally.
We can have a Department of Justice, a Federal Bureau of Investigation that is intent on restricting people's freedom of expression and, going after people in unjust ways. And we can also, see in some cases conduct that I don't think anyone who espouses more nonviolent approaches would condone necessarily. But the situation in the country is extremely tense, and unfortunately, we're seeing political violence, threats of political violence go through the roof from both sides, as they say. So this is a situation that we're contending with.
Yeah, I also think, to your point, that like it is a good flag to be like, look, like if you were in activist group chats, remind people that like what you say, even if you mean it in jest, even if you are not serious, if you don't want, like, don't send it to somebody if you don't want it read it in a court of law, right? Like just like pretty basic legal advice from a non-lawyer. I am not a lawyer, but like, this is basic security protocol. If like you don't want your message read out in a courtroom or show up in an indictment, don't send it. It's just like not a good idea, because often in also in like group chats, you don't know who's in those group chats.
Absolutely, and something that you might say in anger, haste,
or jest,
or jest, absolutely, when removed of context and printed in an indictment, may look absolutely horrific,
Totally.
and not work to your case. I will say, I know that in Minnesota, that there have been labor and faith groups that have decried these indictments, and see them largely as attempts to weaponize the Department of Justice. So I think we also have to look to local voices who know these people and know the situation there,
Totally.
and remember that, I don't know, we'll see how this plays out. I wish we could trust that the rule of law would play out, but I'm not so certain. But on the other hand, to some extent, the courts have been useful in sorting through this stuff and largely turfing out the administration's false claims when they make them, and holding up people's rights to free expression. But this could be a real test. It really could. And I think another angle on this, I suppose, from my perspective, covering these things, we've had multiple pieces on this at techpolicy.press, including from Jenna Ruddock, who's written about this for us in multiple ways. The tech firms have really been on the side of the government when it comes to the rights of ICE protesters, demonstrators, watchers. They have shut down their groups. They have otherwise kind of moved against them on behalf of the administration on after requests from administration officials. And so that's an extremely concerning situation as well. And then that makes me wonder whether they would fight requests for information, whether they would fight the different types of queries that the government might make for information about these individuals.
Yeah, that is also a good point, that like there's a complex of government and private enterprise that is often part of these things. So, Justin, I know that you recently spoke to Representative Lori Trahan about this Artificial Intelligence Act. Could you tell us a little bit about this proposed legislation and kind of like what the state of AI regulation is? Because I think probably a lot of our listeners don't know about the Artificial Intelligence Act.
Well, I mean, maybe before I say a word or two about that particular discussion draft, I'll just say, there is no federal regulation of artificial intelligence, at least of a comprehensive sort, in the United States. There's a lot happening in the states, and there is a lot of action to effectively deny the states the right to engage in regulating artificial intelligence. And this has become a kind of fault line in the politics of AI regulation. To what extent states should have the opportunity to regulate, or to what extent it should be the role of the federal government, and where that line is. What aspects of AI regulation should fall to the federal government versus the states. And that's one of the things that's sort of kind of at stake in the discussion over this discussion draft, which is bipartisan. It came out of Representative Jay Obernolte, who's a Republican from California, and as you said, Lori Trahan, Democrat from Massachusetts. They put it out just earlier this month. But a lot of this is taking place against the backdrop of kind of big headline moments like the release of Anthropic's Mythos and Fable products, and then more recently, big news in my world, those products effectively being made subject to a export control directive by the Trump administration, forcing the company to kind of pull them, offline and make them unavailable. Which is an extraordinary act of AI regulation, an ad hoc act of AI regulation. The government using, more after earlier this year threatening to possibly use the Defense Production Act against Anthropic over, Pentagon's use of its products, ultimately declaring Anthropic a supply chain risk, which is an extraordinary thing, never been applied, I believe, to a domestic company before, kind of an idea that was really intended to be applied to foreign companies and producers. So there's a lot happening, but a lot of it seems to suggest, we don't have a plan. There's no plan. An advanced model comes out, lots of folks look at it and say, oh, this thing's extraordinary for finding vulnerabilities in systems, but it's also, potentially a weapon. What do we do with that? And the fact that the administration acts in this kind of ad hoc way ultimately suggests that there's no plan here. So this piece of legislation that these two congressional representatives have put out, with support from others, I should say, both Democrats and Republicans across the country, it's attempting to kind of address a bunch of different things all at once. I don't know if it would solve everything to do with that situation we just saw with Anthropic and Mythos, but it is trying to get at things like frontier AI governance, the kind of the model layer governance, to answer questions around workforce and cybersecurity and all kinds of things around standards and international cooperation. This is stuff that tech policy nerds love to dig into.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm curious about here too is, like, I know that, for instance, there was some buzz, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago, where Trump was threatening to preempt like state regulation. And that's like one thing that like popped up in my sort of like on my radar about how the government wants to interact with AI companies. Although I guess I had not really thought about the ways that, the Defense Department interacts with Anthropic as a kind of ad hoc regulation. And then the second thing is, like, I just listened to a Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000 breakdown of the Bernie Sanders hearing about, like, Bernie Sanders appears to be fully like AI doomer pilled, which is like pretty wild to me. So when you say things are all over the place, like, I believe it. Like, it just seems like there's not really a consensus, and there's not like even a sort of like partisan or ideological consensus about how we should even approach these things, or like what the real concerns are.
I think that's right. I mean, the fight over preemption, really was hot last summer in the run up to the big, beautiful bill.
Yeah.
There was a provision that was introduced first in the House, then it went through a gauntlet of discussion and drafts and et cetera, ended up in the Senate version advanced by Ted Cruz, the Republican from Texas. And, the idea at first was, well, let's put a moratorium on states being able to enforce AI laws for 10 years. And
That's
eventually
so
it's a long time. Eventually, and that was literally going to be all AI, anything. And it was a lot of questions about whether it would sweep up, anything to do with automated systems. Anybody running a spreadsheet with some automation, and it might have been, possibly hoovered up into the language of that. But that eventually, it got neutered and then struck down or struck out of the budget, I should say, so it didn't pass. Later in the fall, you had the Trump administration issue an executive order promising to use the Justice Department to sue states effectively to kind of challenge their laws around artificial intelligence. And so putting together a group to, scour over these laws and go and challenge the states in particular. And, when Trump signed that. I remember he, explicitly was like, you don't want guys like Governor Pritzker, in Illinois, regulating your AI. He made it explicitly political. It was about his enemies. He doesn't want those people to have the power to do the things. He believed that power should be with him. So that's part of the debate here too. Is like, who gets the power to say yes, to say no to these things? Trump clearly wants it for himself. I think it's good to see representatives in Congress taking a swing at comprehensive regulation. It also, in this case, this proposes a kind of more narrow kind of idea around preemption, a sort of 3-year preemption on regulation at the model layer, effectively at the kind of frontier governance layer. So states would, still be free to regulate on a range of things to do with AI. But it's sort of saying the federal government should be the place where we deal with, maybe the fundamental risks that come from training and model development and, some of the higher level things. I don't know if that'll fly. I mean, a lot of groups have come out against that immediately, and they're not excited about it, including some of the groups that were against preemption in the budget process earlier this year, that have fought with the Trump administration about this. So this may have a difficult path, as anything does in Congress these days. We don't pass much tech regulation at all. And it may be the case that this, isn't able to move forward either. But it is a big, whopping, nearly 300-page attempt at comprehensive AI regulation.
Yeah, the whole time you're talking, in back of my mind, I'm like, I think the 10th Amendment would like a word here. I don't understand why that's not. Is there anybody who's sort of like making that case of like, wait, you can't just stop states from determining their own regulations around these tools?
Well, I think there are definitely arguments that people have made saying, wait a minute, aren't Republicans supposed to believe in devolving power to the states?
We know that's long gone.
There's definitely been that, but there's also been arguments around interstate commerce and how on some level can we don't want to, for instance, maybe fundamentally regulate many things at the state level, right? Whether it's like pharmaceuticals or, different nuclear energy technology or, things of that nature. We look at as that being the province, the domain of the federal government and its regulatory agencies to do. And I think that's the big question. I mean, you do have, important laws that have been developed or passed even in California, New York, Illinois around these things. But the question is, when does that become, a problem? When do we need to have a federal standard? And it's often the case that folks from the left of the center, certainly, are in favor of federal protections, for certain things. And so, this is a difficult one. It's a real third rail right now, I think, in the tech policy debate.
Yeah. And like, I go back to only 7 or 8 years ago thinking, as somebody who's like, yeah, we need regulations all over this stuff. But you look at like when Mark Zuckerberg or the tech bros are being dragged in front of Congress to try and regulate that around like, oh, there's political bias happening in your algorithms or whatever those hearings were. And you see the way that our Congress people are talking about this technology, and it's clear they know nothing. So it's like, how can we trust them to be the ones to write this legislation that may be necessary? It's a big, you've got a lot to cover here for plenty of time.
Yeah, I will say these two representatives, listen, people
I'm not
can argue about. No, I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that these two representatives in particular, people can have different views on whether they choose the right words all the time or can describe the technology in exactly the depth that maybe a computer scientist might. But I do think that they're serious, and they've been involved in these debates for a long time. I don't know. It's tough. Congress has never been known to be on the absolute bleeding edge of keeping up with these things. But these are serious individuals who I think do see the bigger picture.
Cool.
At the end of the day, a lot of what we're arguing about in tech policy is like who gets to make the rules. That's really what we're arguing about. Who gets to make the rules? Is it the White House? Is it Congress? Is it the companies? Is it state houses? And that seems to be, again, what's at stake here.
Right on. Yeah. So where does this fall on our grid? Oh
gosh, I mean, yeah. I think it's reality. If you're like me, it's strong signal. But in general, it's definitely reality. It's definitely a signal to a certain extent. Listen, AI governance is like, it is governance now.
Yeah.
It's like totally. Tech politics is politics. So it matters. It matters, how these technologies, I mean, again, you've got this sitting next to Elon Musk. These things are connected, concentrations of power and wealth. AI is like the greatest concentrator of power and wealth ever, right? It just hoovers up enormous amounts of value and then centralizes it in the hands of so few
people. Yeah.
And that's the question, right? Are we going to let that tech? And again, I understand all the debates about Bernie and his views on these things back and forth, but he is at least asking that question, which I think a lot of folks are asking, which is, how do we share if this technology is going to exist and it is going to be widely deployed? How do we share the value creation? And so we can, we could have a whole other podcast, and I'm sure we might one day, about his proposals.
Back sometime.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it because it sounds weird. I don't know.
Yeah. Totally. And yet on some level, like, the question's the right one. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we
live with the technology? Yeah.
Well, how do we distribute the spoils effectively? Is it something that makes us all somehow healthier, wealthier, and wiser? Or again, does it end up lining Elon Musk's pockets, as he wanders off to Mars? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we're headed more in that direction than we are in the other.
Right on.
Yeah. I think the number of unanswered questions here, I'd put it like below the SpaceX story, closer to the conspiracy line.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
In the degree of which it's like, time will tell. But don't worry, I got plenty of noisy stories I could talk about.
All right. Yeah, let's fill in the left half of this graph, Josh. What do you got for me?
Let's talk about UFC Fight Night on the White House lawn.
Oh my God. We have to? All right.
Well, okay, so I kind of first and foremost want to wrap this up in, like, there's these stories coming out right now about, like, the decorum, the architecture of DC that Trump is destroying and putting things up in his name. And I'm sorry, I love all my older, like, liberal aunties who, like, DM me like, can you believe he's building an arch? It's like, this is so noisy to me because it's like, it's so immaterial, like, in terms of the impact. Oh, the reflecting pool, he thought he could paint it, and now it's just like,
that's just funny.
It's funny, but it's so noisy. Your emotional investment in it does not help us build power to remove him and his ilk, right? And the UFC Fight Night one, I think, is really, like, the highlight of these types of stories, because I mean, there's something to this sort of, like, the spectacle of it all, of, like, the give them bread and circuses kind of madness of, like, there's all these, like, swirling things of, like, empires usually crumble after about 250 years, and they celebrated 250 years of this one with blood sport on the lawn of the president's house. It's like, that's a little weird and fascinating, but at the end of the day, like, it is spectacle. It's, like, immaterial to policy. It doesn't really make a difference. And it also, where there is some sort of, like, cultural signal here is, like, this like two Americas aspect of, you have, like, people going crazy for the Knicks Saturday night in New York, and then, like, a completely different set of people that are stoked about this UFC Fight Night thing, which, like, To be fair, I was shocked by the numbers. Allegedly, 17 million people tuned into the stream, which was exclusive to Paramount Plus, which is a, Ellison-owned, Trump-friendly platform. So they've got some numbers over there. I don't know. I'm very fascinated by this kind of cultural shift towards this like Trumpy fascist aesthetic thing. And like trying to understand what those numbers really look like in both like media and culture consumption. But the other thing that really stood out to me about the White House fight thing were the sponsorships. The people who were helping put it on were like really strong indicators to me of like where, sort of like MAGA and Trump family loyalties lie. And the way these people view the economy is like all the sponsors were things that are basically scams and grifts,
Sure.
So the event was sponsored by crypto.com,
Great.
Polymarket, which is just like Kalshi. It's like for basically insider trading to bet on anything. Meta, which, is Meta. Andrew, which is one of those surveillance tech companies that's named after a Lord of the Rings thing. And then you had like your classic, like your Bud Lights, your Monster Energies. But like those standouts to me say like this is like where they see our economy heading. Like Trump came in this second term saying we're going to bring manufacturing back. And now it's like, oops, it's all scams that happen to filter up to me.
Sure.
It's like, to me, that's an indicator of like weakness of this like authoritarian position of like, you don't materially control anything. And like, we can kind of connect this to his blunder in Iran, but that's too much of a rabbit hole to go down. That to me, it's almost kind of a good signifier, like of how like these companies you're advertising, you show them to the average American and they're like, what is this company? What do they do? Like they trade tokens back and forth that aren't real, that somehow a number goes up and I can make money. Like it's interesting the number of scams and grifts again that are like on the face of this thing, that I think it's an indicator of like another form of like where they're sort of weak and flailing was the most interesting thing to me about the UFC fight night thing. And I would say this is pretty noisy. I don't know if it's reality conspiracy, but
yeah, it definitely is on the left half of the graph. One of the interesting pieces of commentary that I've also seen is like, this is also telling us something about like, in some ways, like what Trump and MAGA is worried about like losing young men, right? That like there's all this sort of like speculation, like are young men fed up with Trump? Like, is this an indicator for the midterms also? That I feel like that to me feels a little conspiratorial, just because we know that like, I don't know, Trump is somebody who loves this kind of like blood sport stuff. And he's always been, he was like involved in WWE for a long time and like all this different, like, this is kind of his bag. Just like these like guys who are younger than us who look like they're in their like mid 50s hitting each other in the face. I don't know.
It's his brand of theater, It's like the joke of like, if somebody had just let Trump become a musical theater star, we could have solved a lot of things. It's like, this is like the fragile masculinity adjacent version of it, that it's like okay for him to interact with.
Yeah, I don't know where it lives in reality versus conspiracy. Justin,
Well, I mean, I will say it was very unreal to see
the hyper reality of it is nuts.
Yeah, fighters like, prepping in the Roosevelt, building, just kind of like, surrounded by these objects and scenes that, we associate with the halls of power. And then to see, these events taking place, it was just so strange. It was very, 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 very strange, and in many ways disconcerting, to say the least. But also, Trump's fascination with these fighters and with their bodies, and
he likes big guys.
it's a strange reality, if you will. That I don't know. I can never quite wrap my head around it. I think that those images, though, and if you can go to the White House Flickr account, which I occasionally do to look for official photos. Some of those images, I think they will be among the indelible images of the Trump second term. They are in many ways iconic, in what they portend. I don't know, that sometimes things are just too much of a kind of symbol, to even feel real on some level.
I would put this just south of conspiracy for some of the reasons Justin said. It's like, there's like a part of me, the stuff he's talking about, how it's so surreal to see them in these halls of power with all these symbols, that it's like, is that on purpose to quote unquote trigger the libs? To what degree is this about triggering the libs? Because like that on a cultural level has been one of the main tenets of like the ideology of this movement for 10 years. Right. And for that reason, I'm like, it's a little conspiratorial.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
Or in some ways, the kind of fruition of conspiracy,
Right.
the kind of ultimate expression of all of that.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, it's like elevating this thing to its highest possible stage.
I mean, not to mention, I guess the other piece that would maybe fit in the conspiracy side of that was the extent to which there are these questions around Trump's investment in UFC, and the extent to which he can be seen as effectively profiting from this.
I forgot to mention he also agreed to pay the fighters in his own crypto coin that's managed by World Liberty Financial, the Trump crypto megacorp or whatever that he's also
all the way down,
leveraged in for millions and millions of dollars. It's wild. Again, it's like you can drive yourself crazy obsessing about the corruption, or just like keep eyes forward and be like, we'll deal with this when we get out of this.
Yeah.
Well, even as we speak, they are draining the green algae water out of the reflecting pool, and apparently flushing it into the Potomac, which, given it's been treated with peroxide and rest of that stuff.
Yeah. Cool.
Everything's fine.
Everything's fine.
And I think, like with his arc, it's like, it'll be fun to tear it down. Like when everybody's like, like they got to tear down all the statues of Mussolini and stuff,
Look, I, for one, am ready.
The day will come.
I think we can leave it here. Thank you both for joining us. And Justin, thank you for bringing we don't get to talk about as much as I'd like to sometimes on the show.
Kate and I love this stuff. I hope our audience does.
Well, I'm grateful. And if this didn't turn you out, you want to nerd out more on tech policy, check out techpolicy.press. But I appreciate you fellows having me.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
My thanks again to Justin Hendrix for joining us today. You can find more of his reporting over at techpolicy.press. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. Trey Nitza is our summer intern and served as our technical director for this episode. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. And of course, if you liked what you heard, please let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes, tell a friend, or rate and review the show wherever you listen. It helps us find new audiences, and it means a lot to our team. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/membership. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. And I hope this helps.